I'm Jessa Carter, 31 years old, and I still remember the sound of my father's voice echoing down a hospital hallway as clearly as if it were yesterday. I was sitting on a stiff white bed, half dazed from pain medication, when he burst through the door and shouted, "Pay rent or get out!" I was still wearing my scrubs, my side stitched tight from a car crash the night before. The room smelled of antiseptic and rain on asphalt, and all I could do was stare at him, too weak to answer. By the time I whispered, "No," his hand was already swinging. That was the moment I realized something in our family had finally snapped, and for once, it wasn't just me. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to choose peace over keeping the peace. My story doesn't start in that hospital room. It began months earlier in a small town outside Kansas City, when life backed me into a corner I swore I'd never stand in again. I'd been a nurse for nearly 7 years, proud of what I'd built, even if the hours were long and the pay never stretched quite far enough. When the clinic cut everyone's shifts and my landlord raised rent the same month, I packed up what little I owned and drove Danny to my father's house. It wasn't out of desire, it was survival. He'd said it would be temporary, but I'd grown up knowing nothing in that house ever came free. The place hadn't changed since I left for nursing school, a modest 2-story with faded siding and a porch that creaked when you looked at it too hard. My old room had turned into a storage space years ago, so he offered the spare one, the one that used to smell like mothballs and stale smoke. I told myself it would only be for a few months, just until I got back on my feet. But the moment I unpacked my suitcase, I felt the old weight settle, in the kind that made you second-guess every breath. At first, the demands came dressed as favors. A few groceries here, gas money there, fixing the Wi-Fi because you're the one who uses it most. I said yes to everything. It was easier that way. I told myself it was just part of pulling my weight, even when it meant skipping my own dental checkups and letting overdue bills pile up. Then my younger brother Evan started hovering around again. He was still living at home, still unemployed, and somehow still the golden boy. Every time I came home from a double shift, he was on the couch, gaming headset glued to his ears, empty pizza boxes stacked beside him like trophies. Whenever I questioned it, my father's voice would drop into that heavy, measured tone I'd grown up fearing. "Family helps family," he'd say, which always meant you pay and don't complain. Evan's bad habits were just phases. My exhaustion was attitude. Even little Danny, who used to hum songs under her breath when she played, started falling silent in that house. One night she asked Mommy, "Is Grandpa mad at me too?" And I couldn't find a single word to make that lie sound true. I tried to focus on work to remind myself this was only temporary, but the tension seeped into everything, meals, mornings, even sleep. My father kept a running tally in his head of what I owed, twisting gratitude into debt. It wasn't just about money. It was control. Every bill I paid bought me another week of quiet, another day, without one of his lectures about how I'd never make it without him. I told myself to endure it a little longer, just until I could save enough to move Danny somewhere better. But even hope started to feel like another bill I couldn't afford. The night before everything fell apart, the rain came down hard enough to blur the world outside the windows. I'd just finished a 30-hour stretch at the clinic and was driving home on autopilot, counting streetlights instead of breaths. I don't remember the truck crossing the lane, only the screech of tires and the burst of white. When I woke up, my ribs were wrapped in gauze, and the doctor was telling me I was lucky. I didn't feel lucky. I felt hollow, the kind of hollow that swallows sound. The next morning, my father appeared at the hospital with no flowers, no concern, and no mention of Danny. Just that single command that would ignite everything to come. As I lay there bleeding beneath the smell of disinfectant, he looked at me not as his daughter, but as an obligation that had overstayed its welcome. And when his hand came down, I knew the bruise wouldn't fade the way others had. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that moment would be the last time he'd ever raise his hand to me. Because while he left that hospital convinced I'd always stay small, I was already thinking of the one thing he couldn't control, what I'd do next. When I left the hospital that afternoon, the air outside felt too bright. My ribs ached with every breath, but the bruise on my cheek burned worse than the stitches. I clutched a small paper bag of prescriptions, trying to move without drawing attention. The nurse offered to call someone to pick me up, but I told her I had it covered. I didn't want anyone else to see me like that, Not the pity, not the questions. I drove myself home, one hand on the steering wheel, the other pressed against my side to keep from shaking. Dad was in the kitchen when I walked in, stirring his coffee like nothing had happened. The morning light spilled through the window, glinting off his watch. He looked up once and said, "You remember to pay the utilities." His voice was casual, as if he hadn't knocked me to the floor 12 hours earlier. "Your room uses the most heat," he added. I couldn't find words. I just nodded, set my bag down, and went straight to Danny's room. She was at school, but her small shoes lined neatly by the door gave me enough reason to keep standing. That night, I sat beside her bed long after she fell asleep. The glow from her nightlight made the room look softer than it was. She had a tiny scar on her cheek from a fall at the playground a few weeks earlier. I'd cried for hours that night, terrified it might leave a mark. Now I was covered in them inside and out, and there wasn't anyone left in that house who cared to notice. I told myself to hold it together for her. That was the only thing that kept my breathing steady. The next morning, a letter slid under my door before sunrise. It wasn't handwritten. It was typed, addressed to me like I was a tenant. Effective immediately, rent will increase by $200 due to additional strain on household income. Payment expected by Friday. House management, G. Carter. For a moment I thought it was a joke, but my father never joked about money. I texted him, "Is this real?" The reply came seconds later. "You live under my roof. You pay what I say. That's how adulthood works." I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. My ribs throbbed and my stomach turned. It would have been easier to leave, but where every dollar I had went toward keeping Danny's medicine cabinet full and food on the table. The thought of moving us into a shelter crossed my mind more than once that week. Still, I paid the utilities on time, handed him half my next paycheck, and hoped he'd stop there. He didn't. 2 days later, Evan knocked on my door. He didn't look up, just leaned against the frame and said, "Hey, Dad, said you'd help with my car insurance this month." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him right. "Your car hasn't moved in weeks," I said. He shrugged, half smiling. "Still got to keep it running." Then he walked off before I could answer. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the sound of his game controller clicking in the next room. It was like living with ghosts who wanted to drain you before they vanished. Even Danny began to sense something was wrong. One night as we brushed our teeth, she asked in a whisper, "Why does Grandpa only talk nice when you give him money?" I froze with the toothbrush in my hand. She was 6 too young to understand how people could twist love into leverage. I wanted to tell her that kindness shouldn't have a price tag, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, I smiled through the mirror and said, "Let's rinse and get ready for bed." By the next week, the tension had settled into the walls. Dad hardly spoke to me unless it was about money. Evan avoided eye contact altogether, like he knew his comfort depended on my silence. Meals were quiet. Even the sound of the refrigerator kicking on made me flinch. I started taking extra shifts again, not for their sake, but because the hospital felt safer than home. One afternoon, Megan showed up unannounced. I'd been ignoring her calls for weeks, too ashamed to explain what was happening. She stood on the porch with 2 grocery bags and a soft gray blanket folded over her arm. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she said, gently setting the bags down. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound cracked before it reached the air. When she asked what was going on, I told her everything, the rent, the slap, the way Dad used Danny to twist the knife. She didn't interrupt, just listened. When I finished, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small brass key attached to a faded ribbon. "Your mom asked me to hold this for you," she said quietly. "She told me to give it to you when things got too hard." The metal was cold in my palm, and near the base the letter M was engraved. I hadn't thought about my mother's things in years. She'd passed from ovarian cancer 3 summers earlier, quietly, quickly. My father hadn't spoken much at the funeral. They'd been divorced long before she died, and I guess grief was just another thing he refused to pay for. She'd lived simply in a little craftsman house she inherited from her father, a place filled with the smell of lavender and old books. I hadn't set foot there since the funeral. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark, turning the key over in my hand, wondering what she'd wanted me to find. The rhythm of the ceiling fan hummed above me, steady as a heartbeat. Danny slept curled beside me, her bunny tucked under her chin, unaware that something had shifted. I realized I didn't just have a key, I had a direction. The next morning, I packed a thermos of tea, dropped Danny off at school, and drove to my mother's old house. The neighborhood was quieter than I remembered. The same wind chimes hung by the porch, faded and tangled, but still catching the breeze. Inside, the air smelled like dust and lavender. I ran my hand along the banister, the same one I used to slide down as a kid, and walked through the rooms in silence. Her rocking chair sat by the window, a half-finished quilt draped over the arm. For a moment, I could almost hear her humming. I searched the house room by room until I reached her bedroom. In the back of the closet stood a tall metal filing cabinet. I'd seen it hundreds of times growing up, always locked, always off limits. I pulled the key from my pocket. My fingers trembled as it slid into the lock and turned with a click that echoed in my chest. Inside were neatly labeled folders, stacked in perfect order. Property, East Oak, bank, trust account, letters to J. I reached for the last one. Inside were 3 things: a notarized letter naming me as the sole beneficiary of her father's estate, a deed for the property we were living in my father's house, and a handwritten note. It read, "If you're reading this, it means you've endured more than I ever wanted for you. They will take until nothing is left. This house is yours now. Use it. Protect Danny. Never let guilt be the leash that binds you." I sat down on the floor, the papers trembling in my hands. For years I thought I was a guest under his roof, a burden he tolerated. But the truth was written in black ink and notarized seals. The house belonged to me. My mother had seen this coming and built a way out I never knew existed. I stayed in that room until the sun began to fade through the curtains. The air felt lighter, cleaner somehow. I wasn't free yet, but for the first time I wasn't trapped either. As I locked the door behind me and stepped onto the porch, I realized something that made my knees weak. I didn't have to keep surviving in someone else's house. When I drove back to town that evening, I didn't stop at my father's place. I went to Megan's instead. Danny was thrilled to have a sleepover with her godmother coloring at the table, while Megan and I sat in quiet disbelief over what I'd found. That night, I slept for the first time in months. The next morning, sunlight streamed across the kitchen table as I folded the documents into a manila envelope. I traced the edges with my thumb, steady this time. I knew what I had to do next, because now I had proof, and soon my father would too. The week after I found my mother's letter, I moved through the house like a stranger. Every noise seemed sharper, every word heavier. Dad sat at the kitchen table most mornings, scribbling on napkins and old envelopes, acting as if life hadn't already shifted under his feet. Evan stayed glued to the couch headset on cereal bowl, perched on his stomach, the picture of someone who had never worried about a bill in his life. I knew if I spoke too soon, they'd twist the truth before I could even breathe it. So I stayed quiet. At night, after Danny fell asleep, I began collecting everything I could, proof of every payment, every charge that had my name attached. I snapped photos of utility bills showing I was the primary payer, saved bank transfers and text messages, even old Venmo receipts, where Evan wrote things like, "Thanks sis again." I bought a cheap flash drive and labeled it Monroe House Documentation. The name looked sterile, but it made me feel focused. Megan helped me one afternoon after her shift, sorting files into folders at her kitchen table while Danny colored beside us. "You're doing the right thing," she said quietly. "Just make sure it's airtight before you move." We filed a formal request with the county clerk's office the following week. I remember the way my hands trembled as I signed my name at the counter. When the clerk handed me the official copy of the property record, I felt something solid for the first time in years. The deed listed one owner, Jessa M. Carter. There was no shared title, no lien, no mention of Gregory Carter anywhere. My grandfather's trust had transferred everything to my mother, and my mother had sealed it to me before she passed. It was all legal, all clean. Still, I kept it to myself. The quiet gave me time to think. Danny's laughter returned bit by bit in those days, soft at first like a song she'd forgotten the words to. But even that small piece didn't last long. One Tuesday night, I came home from a short shift to find her sitting on her bed, tracing the ears of her stuffed bunny. Her eyes were red. "Grandpa said if I keep leaving the lights on, we might not have a place to stay," she whispered. I knelt beside her, brushing the hair from her forehead. "You're safe," I told her softly. "This is our home. She didn't answer. She just turned her face into the pillow the way children do when they're trying not to cry. That was the moment something inside me settled. I was done trying to keep the peace. That night, I recorded a short video on my phone. I sat on the edge of my bed, my face still, my voice even. I told the truth, the slap in the hospital, the rent demands, the emotional strain, and how long I'd been the one paying for everything while they took credit. Then I added small clips, Evan's live streams bragging about never paying a dime, Dad's text messages, and the hospital bill in my name. I titled the folder, For Danny, in case. 2 days later, I called attorney Frank Delaney, the same man who'd handled my mother's estate years ago. When I explained what I'd found and what had been happening, he didn't hesitate. "You have every legal right to file for eviction," he said. "Given the abuse, you might also qualify for a protective order." He promised to prepare the paperwork by the end of the week. I drove to his office that Friday with the documents from the filing cabinet tucked neatly into a brown envelope. When he slid the forms across the desk, I signed without shaking this time. "For the record," he asked gently, "are you sure this is what you want to do?" I met his eyes. "I'm not doing this out of anger," I said. "I'm doing it to stop paying for silence." Saturday morning came calm and gray. The kind of morning that looks like nothing will ever happen, though everything is about to. Danny was asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket after a movie night. I stood in the kitchen brewing coffee, the smell filling the air, my heart steady. Dad walked in, rubbing his jaw, same routine as always. "Where's the rent?" he asked, like it was just another line in his script. I set the mug down and said, "I'm not paying rent anymore." He froze. "What did you just say?" His voice was quiet, but it carried that old weight that used to make me flinch as a kid. I didn't flinch this time. "I said no," I replied. He laughed short and sharp. "You think I owe you something for that hospital nonsense? You wouldn't even have a roof if it weren't for me." I reached into my bag and placed the folder on the table between us. "You mean the roof I own?" For a second there was nothing but the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. He looked at the papers, his jaw tightening. Then came the flicker panic, brief and unmistakable, before anger rushed in to cover it. "You ungrateful child," he snapped, stepping forward. I didn't move. Evan shuffled into the room, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on?" Dad turned to him, still pointing at me. "She's saying she owns the house now." "You believe this?" Evan scoffed. "Please. She can't even keep an apartment lease. She's bluffing." I turned toward him. "The only reason you've had electricity, Wi-Fi, and that endless stream of takeout is because I've been paying for it," I said evenly. His smirk slipped. Dad's voice rose again. "This is still my house. I built this life. You don't get to take that from me." I met his stare and said, "You didn't build it. Grandpa did. Mom protected it. And she gave it to me because she knew exactly how this would play out. He changed tactics like he always did when yelling didn't work." His tone softened. "You're really going to throw your own family out, after everything we've done for you." I took a deep breath. "I'm not evicting family," I said. "I'm evicting abuse," Evan muttered under his breath. "What, you think you're some hero now going to ride off into the sunset with your kid?" I almost smiled. "No," I said. "I'm just putting the locks where they belong." That was when Evan lost it. He threw his cereal bowl against the floor, milk splattering across the tiles. The sound woke Danny on the couch. She sat up, eyes wide, clutching her bunny. "Mom!" I turned to her, my voice calm. "It's okay, baby." She looked from me to her grandfather, then to her uncle. "Are we leaving?" she asked quietly. I crouched beside her and said, "No, sweetheart." "They are." The silence that followed was the kind that fills every corner of a house, where no one can pretend anymore. Dad's mouth opened, then closed again. Evan stood frozen, his face red, unsure what to do next. I reached for Danny's hand and led her upstairs, away from the mess. Behind me, I heard Dad mutter something low, but I didn't stop. By Monday, the official eviction notice was printed and ready. Frank called to confirm that a deputy would deliver it within the week. I folded the papers into an envelope and placed it by the door. The house was quiet that night. Even the air felt different, like it knew the change coming. Danny fell asleep beside me, her hand resting lightly on mine. As I watched her breathe steady and safe, I realized the hardest part wasn't the confrontation. It was everything that came before it. The years of shrinking myself to keep others comfortable. The silence that used to feel like safety. That time was over now. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight crept through the blinds. I got up quietly, careful not to wake her, and poured a cup of coffee. The kitchen still smelled faintly of spilled milk, but beneath it was something cleaner, like the beginning of air after a storm. I stood by the window watching the yard, waiting for the sound of the deputy's car to pull into the drive. And when it finally did, I knew what it meant. This time the paper wasn't another demand. It was the end of one chapter and the start of everything that came after. By the time the eviction notice was taped to the front door, the house felt like a storm waiting to break. I came home from volunteering at Danny's school and saw the white paper fluttering in the breeze. The county seal sat at the top, stamped and final. Through the living room window, my father stood motionless, the notice clutched in his hand while Evan paced behind him like a trapped animal. The silence between them was heavier than any argument. When I opened the door, Dad's voice hit first. "You think you can do this to us after everything we've done for you?" His words came sharp, echoing through the walls. I met his glare without a word. "You mean after you slapped me in a hospital bed?" I asked. He froze. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Shock maybe, but it was gone before I could tell. He threw the paper onto the table. "This is war," he said. Evan crossed his arms, smirking behind him. "We're not going anywhere," he muttered. I picked up the document and slid it neatly back toward them. "You have 30 days," I said quietly. "You know that." The next day, the whispers started. Val, our neighbor across the street, waited by her mailbox when I got home from work. She didn't smile. "Heard you're throwing your sick father out of his own house," she said flatly. I blinked. "Excuse me." She crossed her arms. "Greg told me he's been diagnosed with something lungs, I think, and that you refuse to help with his appointments." My stomach turned. I wanted to argue, but what good would it do? By the time I walked up the steps, I could already hear my father inside coughing, just loud enough to be heard through the open windows. When I stepped into the living room, he was reclined on the couch, a tissue in hand, his voice weak and gravelly. "Don't mind me," he said between shallow breaths. "Just trying to get some air." Evan wasn't there, but his phone was propped up on the table, camera light blinking. I realized he was live streaming again. The pieces came together fast. Dad's sudden illness, Evan's online followers, the guilt they were trying to sell. They weren't preparing to leave. They were building an audience. That night, the doorbell rang. Leah, the young woman from 3 houses down, stood on the porch, holding her phone. "Hey," she said softly. "I think you should see this." She turned the screen toward me. It was a hospital hallway, white floors, fluorescent lights, and then my father's voice shouting, "Pay rent or get out!" The slap followed sharp and clear. My body hitting the floor. Danny's cry, the nurses rushing in. I felt my knees weaken. "I work at that hospital," Leah said quietly. "I saw the footage before it got wiped. I sent it to myself, just in case." She hesitated, then added, "You should have proof if he tries anything else." For a long moment, I couldn't speak. The only sound was the soft hum of the porch light. "Thank you," I finally whispered. She nodded and stepped back into the night. I closed the door and leaned against it, holding the phone to my chest. The evidence was real, no more arguments, no more doubts. I went to the kitchen and transferred the file to my flash drive labeled, "For Danny, in case." The name felt different now. Not just a precaution, a shield. When I walked into the living room, Danny sat at the table coloring quietly. She glanced up as I entered. "Are we still doing the right thing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Yes, sweetheart," I said. "We are." She looked down at her drawing again, a small house under a bright sun, 2 figures holding hands in front. For the first time in months, she smiled. The days that followed were tense. My father alternated between silence and sudden outbursts, while Evan spent hours on calls muttering about finding a lawyer or going viral. The neighbors grew curious, their blinds shifting whenever I stepped outside. Megan stopped by often bringing dinner or sitting quietly on the porch after Danny went to bed. "You're holding up," she said one night. Barely I replied, but I meant it as a promise. Friday morning came early. I woke before dawn, heart pounding but steady. The house was still of the kind of quiet that sits before a storm. Danny was curled up on the couch, her blanket pulled to her chin, Bunny tucked close. I kissed her forehead, whispering, "Today's the day." Outside, the air was cool and still. The dew on the grass glimmered under the soft light of sunrise. By 9 o'clock, the county deputy's car pulled up to the curb. He stepped out, clipboard in hand, polite and professional. Val's curtains twitched across the street, and Leah came onto her porch phone in hand, but face calm. My father appeared in the doorway, voice rising before the deputy even reached the steps. "You're letting her throw her father into the street," he shouted. "You should be arresting her for elder abuse." The deputy didn't flinch. "Mr. Carter," he said evenly, "this is a lawful eviction. You've been served. Today is the deadline." Evan appeared behind him, hoodie half-zipped, eyes bloodshot. "You're making a mistake," he told me. "No one's going to believe you." I held up a small flash drive, its metal surface glinting in the morning sun. "They already do." The deputy nodded once. I plugged the drive into his tablet, and he watched a few seconds, the slap, the fall, the scream. His expression didn't change, but his tone did. "That's more than enough," he said quietly. My father tried to step forward, but the deputy raised a hand. "Sir, if you escalate, I'll have to detain you." Evan's face flushed red. "You think this is justice," he said bitterly. "This is revenge." I looked at him and said, "No, this is freedom." Across the street, a few neighbors had gathered. Murmurs passed through the small crowd, low and uncertain. Val finally stepped onto her porch, arms folded. "You could have worked this out quietly, Jessa," she called. "Family isn't something you throw away." I turned to face her. "Family doesn't slap you in a hospital bed while your child watches," I said, my voice clear and calm. The words hung in the air. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Wait!" "What?" I stepped onto the porch, papers in hand. "This house was left to me by my mother," I continued. "My grandfather owned it. My name is on the deed. And for years I paid for this household while being insulted, ignored, and hurt." No one spoke. The deputy handed me a form confirming possession. "Ma'am," he said, "the property is yours, uncontested." My father's shoulders sagged. Evan dropped his duffel bag on the porch, the sound hollow against the wood. As they stepped down the stairs, Dad turned one last time. "You'll regret this," he said, voice hoarse. I met his eyes. "No," I told him softly. "I regret letting it go on this long." When the door closed behind them, the quiet felt different, clean, almost fragile. Danny slipped her hand into mine. "We're safe now," she whispered. I kissed her forehead. "Yes, baby," I said. "We are." That night, I stood on the porch watching the sunset burn low across the sky. The air smelled like lavender from the bushes below. The house was still, but for the first time, it felt peaceful. Inside, Danny's laughter echoed faintly from her room. The space that once held fear now held something new room to breathe. But as I watched the last light fade, I knew we couldn't stay here. The walls still remembered too much. The bruises might fade, but the echoes would not. It was time to let the house go and build something of our own. The house was quiet after they left too quiet. Every sound, the tick of the kitchen clock, the creak of the porch boards, seemed to echo through rooms that suddenly felt too large. I sat at the table long after the deputy's car disappeared, the eviction papers still in my hand, the words blurred as the late afternoon light shifted across them. For the first time in years, there was no one else's voice demanding correcting or controlling, just silence and the hum of the refrigerator. That night, Danny slept deeper than I'd ever seen. She didn't flinch in her dreams, didn't call out or wake halfway through the night. Her little arms stretched across the pillow, her stuffed bunny tucked against her cheek. I stayed beside her until dawn, half afraid the quiet would break. When the morning came, the house didn't feel heavy anymore, it just felt empty. Over the next few days, I went through every corner of that place. The spare bedroom still smelled like my father's cologne, sharp and bitter, mixed with the faint scent of old coffee. Evan's room looked exactly as he'd left it. Clothes in piles, controller cords tangled on the floor, the curtains drawn tight. I opened the window and let the air in, watching dust float in the sunlight. The house wasn't cruel by itself, but it carried everything that had happened inside it. Every argument, every bruise, every quiet moment I'd forced myself to swallow. When Megan stopped by that weekend, she brought a box of takeout and a small bouquet of daisies. We ate at the kitchen counter, the only place that didn't feel haunted. "You could stay," she said gently. "You own it now. Make it yours." I shook my head. "I don't want Danny to grow up remembering these walls," I said. She nodded, not pressing further. We talked for a while about listings. She'd seen a few small rentals across town, one with a fenced yard and another with a porch that caught the morning light. That night, after Danny went to bed, I sat with a notepad and calculator running numbers. Between my savings, the trust income, and the equity from the house, we could manage a new start. I called Frank the next morning and told him I wanted to sell. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice calm but concerned. "It's a big decision." "I'm sure," I said. "I don't want that house anymore." He promised to handle the paperwork quietly. The sale went faster than I expected. 2 weeks later, we signed the closing documents. I walked through each room one last time. The kitchen light flickered faintly when I turned it off, and the hallway smelled faintly of the lavender air freshener my mother used to keep in her room. I stopped at the doorway where Danny had once drawn with sidewalk chalk on the floor, small hearts that never fully scrubbed out. I let my hand rest on the wall and whispered a thank you to my mother, maybe, or to the version of myself who finally stood up. Then I closed the door and didn't look back. Our new place sat on a quiet street near the edge of town, a small cottage with 2 bedrooms and a porch wrapped in climbing ivy. The rent was modest, the space simple but bright. Danny picked her room immediately, the one that faced east. "So Bunny can wake up with the sun," she said, pointing at the window. The landlord, an older woman named Mrs. Lawson, left a basket of fresh lavender on the steps to welcome us. The air smelled clean, like promise. The first night there, we had dinner on paper plates and sat cross-legged on the living room floor. Danny giggled as she balanced noodles on her fork. "Can we paint my room blue?" she asked. "Sky blue," I said, "like morning light." She nodded, satisfied. Later, when she fell asleep, I stood in the doorway watching her breathe. For the first time in years, her face looked completely at ease. The days that followed were quiet in the best way. I found a rhythm again, morning walks with Danny to school, double shifts at the hospital, coffee on the porch before sunrise. Megan stopped by most weekends, helping unpack boxes, or just sitting beside me while Danny painted in the yard. One afternoon, Megan looked around the small living room and smiled. "This place feels like you," she said. I didn't answer right away, just poured her another cup of coffee and watched the light spill across the hardwood floor. I started therapy around that time, something I'd put off for years. The first few sessions were hard, saying things out loud I'd buried under exhaustion and duty. My therapist, Dr. Elaine Murphy, was patient and steady. "You spent a long time surviving," she said during one session. "Now you're learning how to live." I thought about that later while folding laundry, realizing how quiet my thoughts had become. As the weeks passed, I began to notice small changes. I no longer jumped when my phone buzzed. I didn't brace myself before unlocking the door after work. The tension that once lived in my shoulders began to ease. Danny brought home drawings from school, pictures of us in front of the cottage, sunlight filling the sky, no gray clouds anywhere. I kept each one on the refrigerator. One Sunday morning, we stood on the porch while she brushed Bunny's fur with a soft toothbrush. The breeze lifted her hair, and she turned to me with that bright, curious look she always had. "Mommy," she asked, "do you think Bunny's proud of us?" I smiled and crouched beside her. "I think Bunny always knew we were strong," I said. She giggled, tucking the toy under her arm. The lavender bushes swayed behind us, the scent drifting through the air. Inside, I sat at the table with my coffee, watching sunlight move across the room. I realized I wasn't waiting for anything anymore, not for permission, not for forgiveness, not for a call that would never come. The house we'd left behind had been a cage, but it had also been proof that I could break one. Later that week, I drove past our old street on the way to the store. The house looked smaller somehow, stripped of the power it once held. New curtains hung in the windows, and a fresh coat of paint covered the porch rail. I didn't stop, just slowed enough to see that life had moved on inside those walls, too. When I got home, Danny was playing on the floor, surrounded by crayons and paper. She looked up and grinned. "Look, Mommy," she said, holding up a new drawing. 2 figures standing in front of a blue house, a sun above them, lavender blooming along the fence. At the bottom, she'd written in uneven letters, "Our real home." I took the paper from her and held it carefully as if it were something fragile. "It's perfect," I told her. And it was. That evening, Megan stopped by again with a pie from the bakery near the hospital. We sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the trees. The air hummed with crickets, and Danny's laughter drifted through the open window. Megan leaned back in her chair and said, "You're different now. You know that I looked out toward the fading light. I guess I stopped carrying things that weren't mine," I said. She smiled, setting her cup down. "Keep it that way." As the sky turned to gold, Danny came out to join us, Bunny in her arms. She climbed into my lap and rested her head against my shoulder. For a while, none of us spoke. The breeze was soft, the world finally still. And as the first stars appeared, I realized something simple and certain: the past didn't own us anymore. We did. Summer arrived with the kind of heat that slowed everything down. The lavender by the porch bloomed thick and fragrant, and mornings began with sunlight spilling across the kitchen table. Danny liked to sit there drawing while I packed lunches, her crayons scattered everywhere. Most days were simple, now work, school, home, but there was a quiet rhythm in that simplicity that I hadn't felt in years. I had started therapy with Dr. Murphy every other Thursday. Her office was a converted attic above a bookstore downtown, filled with soft lamps and the faint smell of coffee. The first time I climbed those stairs, I didn't know what to say. She didn't push. She just asked, "How long have you been holding your breath?" It took weeks before I answered that question. Sometimes the silence between us said more than words could. At work, the other nurses began to notice small changes too. I smiled more, laughed at things I'd ignored before. My supervisor, Linda Harris, pulled me aside one morning. "You've been different lately," she said, "in a good way." I just nodded. She didn't need to know the details. It was enough that I finally felt steady again. Megan remained a constant. Every weekend she came by with groceries or fresh coffee, claiming she was checking in, though I knew she just didn't like me spending Saturdays alone. Sometimes we sat outside while Danny painted on the porch steps. One afternoon, Megan leaned back in her chair, squinting toward the sunlight. "Do you ever think you'll hear from them again?" she asked quietly. I didn't answer right away. The truth was, I had wondered that myself. The call came the next evening. I was rinsing dishes when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. For a second, I almost ignored it. Then I saw the area code. It was from my old neighborhood. Against my better judgment, I answered, "Jessa." The voice on the other end was strained, but familiar. "It's Evan." I froze. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my tone even. He hesitated. "Dad's not doing great," he said finally. He's been coughing a lot. The doctor says it might be serious." I didn't say anything. He continued. "We're staying with Aunt Carol now. I thought you should know." The silence stretched until he added, "He misses you." I hung up without replying. My hands shook as I set the phone down. Danny was in the living room watching a cartoon, her laughter carrying down the hallway. I leaned against the counter and tried to steady my breathing. The words echoed in my head. "He misses you." After everything, it still had the power to stir something sharp and complicated inside me. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker against the quiet houses. The air smelled like rain, heavy and warm. Part of me wanted to believe Evan, to think maybe my father finally understood what he'd done. But another part, the one that had learned the hard way, reminded me of the slap, the letters, the hospital floor. Some apologies come too late, I thought. The next morning, I mentioned the call to Dr. Murphy. She listened, her hands folded loosely in her lap. "It's okay to feel conflicted," she said. "You can care about someone's well-being without reopening the door that hurt you." Her words sat with me all week. By Friday, a letter arrived in the mail. No return address, just my name written in shaky handwriting. I knew before I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, creased and thin. The first line read, "Jessa, I know you won't pick up the phone, so I'm trying this instead." The rest was a mix of apologies and excuses, how he'd been sick, how Evan had struggled, how he never meant for things to go so far. At the bottom he'd written, "You've always been stronger than I gave you credit for. I see that now." I folded the letter once and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger either, just a strange stillness. I knew what this was, a man realizing too late that control had cost him everything. That weekend, Megan and I took Danny to a small park near the lake. The day was bright, the air full of laughter and children's voices. Danny ran ahead with her kite, the string trailing behind her, as the blue fabric caught the wind. Watching her, I felt something lift, a lightness I hadn't known I was still waiting for. Later that night, after Danny fell asleep, I found myself standing by her door, listening to her soft breathing. The moonlight fell across her bedspread, catching the pale blue walls she'd chosen. I thought of all the nights she'd whispered, "Are we safe?" and how now finally she didn't need to ask. I went to the kitchen and made tea. The letter still sat on the counter where I'd left it. I stared at it for a long time before lighting a match and holding it over the sink. The paper curled and darkened, the words disappearing into ash. When it was done, I rinsed the sink clean. The past wasn't mine to hold anymore. Monday came like any other day. I walked Danny to school, the air cool against our faces. At the gate she turned and waved her small hand bright against the morning sky. "Love you, Mommy," she called. "Love you more," I said back. On the walk home, I passed the bakery and caught my reflection in the window. For the first time, I recognized the woman looking back. That evening, Leah stopped by. She was moving out of her place near the old neighborhood and wanted to say goodbye before relocating across the state. "You deserve the peace you found," she said, handing me a small envelope. Inside was a printed still from the hospital video, blurred but unmistakable. "I deleted the rest," she said. "You don't need it anymore." After she left, I slipped the photo into a drawer beside Danny's drawings. It wasn't a trophy, just proof of how far we'd come. The kind you keep not to look at, but to remember what not to return to. The next few weeks settled into a calm I hadn't known possible. I found myself smiling at small things, fresh coffee sunlight on the porch, the sound of Danny's laughter drifting from her room. Megan teased me one evening as we shared pie at the table. "You look like someone who finally got her life back," she said. I smiled. Maybe I did. When I lay in bed that night, Danny's soft snores coming from down the hall, I realized Dr. Murphy had been right. Healing wasn't about forgiveness or forgetting. It was about finally breathing without fear. Outside, the wind stirred the lavender bushes, their scent carrying through the open window. The world felt wide again, like there was finally space for something new to grow. And as I drifted toward sleep, I understood the quiet truth at the center of everything. Sometimes peace isn't given, it's claimed. The morning started like any other sunlight filtering through the curtains, the smell of coffee filling the kitchen, and Danny humming softly as she packed her crayons into her backpack. Our little routine had become a rhythm. I trusted breakfast. Laughter, the quick rush out the door before the first bell. Peace had a shape now, and it lived in these quiet mornings. After dropping Danny at school, I stopped by the cafe near the hospital for a muffin before my shift. That's when I saw him. My father sat at a corner table, thinner than I remembered, his shoulders hunched under a worn jacket. For a moment I thought about walking past the window, pretending I hadn't seen him. But then he looked up and our eyes met. He stood slowly, his expression a mix of guilt and something softer I hadn't seen since childhood. I didn't move, just waited by the counter as he approached. "Jessa," he said quietly, voice rough like gravel, "can we sit for a minute?" I hesitated, then nodded. We found a small table by the window, the air between us thick with everything unsaid. He cleared his throat. "I didn't think you'd answer the letter." I stirred my coffee without replying. "Evan's been staying with friends," he continued. "Things got hard after we left. I haven't been well." I noticed the way his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. He looked older, smaller somehow. The weight he'd carried all his life seemed to have finally settled into his bones. "I'm not here to fight," he said after a moment. "I just wanted to tell you that I'm sorry. For all of it. I thought I was doing what a father should. I see now that I was wrong." For a long time I said nothing. The clatter of dishes and soft music from the cafe filled the silence. "You hurt me," I said finally, my voice low. "You hurt Danny. And you didn't stop even when I begged you to." He nodded, eyes fixed on the table. "I know," he said, "and I'll live with that. I just wanted you to know I'm trying to make things right, at least a little." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. "This isn't about money," he said, sliding it across the table. "It's paperwork. The last bit of what your mother left the savings account I kept buried all these years. It's yours now. Should have been a long time ago. I didn't touch it. Why now, I asked." He sighed. "Because I can't undo the rest, but I can stop taking what was never mine." Before I could respond, he stood. "You don't owe me forgiveness," he said quietly. "Just don't let anger steal any more of your life." Then he walked out into the morning light, disappearing into the hum of the street. I sat there for a long while staring at the envelope. When I finally opened it, inside was a single page, a transfer of funds signed and notarized with my mother's handwriting in the witness line from years earlier. The account wasn't large, but it was hers. It was enough to feel like a piece of her had found its way back to me. That evening, after Danny fell asleep, I told Megan what had happened. She listened quietly, her face unreadable. "Are you okay?" she asked. I nodded. "It didn't feel like closure," I said. "More like release." Megan smiled softly. "Sometimes that's all it needs to be." The next day I met with Frank at his office to handle the paperwork. He reviewed the transfer, nodding as he flipped through the pages. "This looks legitimate," he said. "I'll file it first thing tomorrow." As he packed the folder, he looked at me thoughtfully. "Your mother planned well," he said. "She wanted to make sure you'd always land on your feet." Driving home, I rolled the windows down. The wind whipped through my hair, carrying the scent of cut grass and sun-warmed pavement. For the first time, the memory of my mother didn't sting. It felt like warmth spreading quietly through the cracks of everything that had once been broken. That weekend, I used part of the money to open a small college savings account in Danny's name. When I handed her the little bank card with her name printed across it, she tilted her head. "What's this for?" she asked. "For your dreams," I said. "Whatever you decide they are." She smiled, tucking it into her backpack like a treasure. Later, I sat on the porch with Megan, the air heavy with the scent of lavender and evening rain. "It's strange," I said. "I thought facing him would reopen everything, but it didn't." She nodded. "You already did the hard part. You stopped needing his permission to be free." The next week at therapy, Dr. Murphy asked how I felt about the encounter. I told her it was like standing in front of a door I'd already locked from the inside. "He can knock," I said, "but I don't have to open it." She smiled faintly. "That's growth, Jessa. Real growth." Life settled again. Work, home, bedtime stories, quiet dinners. Some days I still caught myself listening for a phone call or a letter that never came. But the ache was softer now, like a healed scar you only notice when you move a certain way. One evening, after tucking Danny in, I found myself standing by the window looking out at the porch light flickering against the night. Across the street, Mrs. Lawson watered her garden, waving when she saw me. I waved back, thinking how far I'd come from the woman who once thought peace was something she had to earn. Before bed, I opened the small wooden box on my nightstand, the one where I kept my mother's note, Danny's first drawing of our house, and now the transfer paper from my father. I read my mother's words again, the ones she'd written years ago. "They will take until nothing is left. Protect your peace and never let guilt be the leash that binds you." I closed the lid and turned off the light. For the first time in a long time, I didn't dream of running or rebuilding. I dreamed of standing still, of finally being home. The next morning, the sun rose soft and gold over the porch, and Danny came bounding into the room, hair tangled, smile wide. "Mommy, can we bake today?" she asked. "Megan said she's bringing strawberries." I laughed, pulling her close. "Then we'd better get started." As we mixed flour and sugar in the kitchen, sunlight poured through the window, warm against my hands. Danny hummed to herself, her laughter spilling over like music. And somewhere inside me a quiet voice whispered that maybe this simple ordinary morning was what healing was supposed to look like. I didn't know what would come next, or if my father would ever call again. But it didn't matter. The life we were building now was rooted in truth, not fear, and for the first time, I wasn't looking back. The year turned softly after that, days stretching longer, the air warm enough that lavender bloomed early along the porch. Danny grew taller, seemingly overnight. Her laughter filled every corner of our little cottage, bright and steady, like sunlight through open windows. Life didn't feel heavy anymore. It just felt full. Work stayed busy, but in a way that made sense now. I took extra shifts by choice, not obligation, saving up for a weekend trip with Danny. Every morning before dawn, I still made coffee the same way, slowly, one careful pour at a time, but it tasted different these days. There was no fear waiting in the silence, no weight pressing on my chest, just calm. Dr. Murphy once told me that healing rarely feels like victory. It feels like breathing after holding your breath too long. She was right. It wasn't one big moment that changed everything. It was all the small ones that came after the quiet mornings, the easy laughter, the way Danny no longer flinched at sudden noise. Even the stillness between us felt safe now. Sometimes I caught myself glancing at the old wooden box on my nightstand, the one holding my mother's note, the house papers, and a few photographs. I didn't open it often anymore, but knowing it was there grounded me. The past no longer burned. It simply existed like pages in a book already read. One Saturday, Megan joined us for breakfast. She brought fresh strawberries from the market and her usual energy that filled a room before she even spoke. "You know," she said, pouring syrup over pancakes, "this place finally feels like you." I smiled, looking around the kitchen, the mismatched chairs, Danny's artwork taped to the fridge, the scent of lavender drifting through the window. "It is," I said, "every bit of it." That afternoon, Danny and I planted a small rose bush by the porch. Her hands were covered in dirt, her hair a tangled halo under the sun. "Will it grow fast?" she asked. "Maybe not fast," I said, helping her pat the soil down, "but strong." She nodded like she understood something bigger. And maybe she did. A week later, a letter arrived. This time it wasn't from my father. It was from the bank confirming that the savings transfer had cleared. I stared at the statement for a long moment, not because of the amount, but because of what it represented. It was the final tie, the last loose thread. My mother's foresight, my father's belated act of conscience, it all ended there. I slipped the letter into the box and closed the lid. That night, Danny crawled into bed beside me, clutching her bunny. "Mommy," she whispered, "you're happy now, right?" I turned to her and smiled. "I am, sweetheart." She nodded sleepily, as if that answer made the world feel steady enough to dream in. As I lay awake, listening to her even breathing, I thought about how far we'd come. Not just from the house we left behind, but from the fear that used to live in our bones. I used to think strength was about enduring, about standing still, no matter how much it hurt. But now I understood it differently. Real strength was choosing peace, walking away, even when it meant walking alone. Megan said once that I'd taught her something about resilience. I told her she had it backward. What I learned was that survival isn't meant to last forever. You survive until you can live. And living, I realized, is what we were finally doing. One Sunday evening, we sat on the porch watching the sunset bleed across the sky, soft orange fading into blue. Danny leaned against me, humming to herself. The lavender swayed gently in the breeze, and I felt that quiet kind of joy that doesn't announce itself, it just stays. I don't know what happened to my father after that last meeting. Maybe he found a way to make peace with himself, or maybe he didn't. I stopped needing to know. Some stories don't close neatly, they just fade into distance. What mattered was that ours had found its ending, the kind built not on revenge or regret, but release. Now, whenever I drive past the old neighborhood, I don't look for the house anymore. I look at the sky instead, the same one that hung over us through every hard season, and I think of my mother's words, "Protect your peace. Never let guilt be the leash that binds you." She was right. Peace isn't something anyone gives you. It's something you claim one decision at a time. And as the sun dipped below the trees, Danny pointed at the horizon, her voice small but sure. "It's pretty," she said. "It is," I answered, holding her close. "It always was. We just had to get here to see it. If you've ever had to start over to rebuild from the pieces someone tried to take from you, I hope this story reminds you can. You can lose everything familiar and still find yourself again. And if it did take a moment to share it with someone who might need that reminder too, because sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that save us."